Well, media has been consumed with stories about the Ebola virus for weeks. Among the discussion have been claims that the first victim to die of the virus here in the United States died because of racism. Thomas Eric Duncan died last Wednesday. The claims of racism have been made by the Dallas County Commissioner John Wiley Price and by the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who wrote in the Huffington Post, quote, "Duncan has a foreign accent, black skin, and no health insurance. From a theological perspective, Thomas Eric Duncan is one of our brothers described by Jesus as the least of these. So what role did his lack of privilege play in the treatment he received?" End quote. So the big question, is racism or a lack of privilege responsible for Duncan's death? I had the chance to speak earlier with the Reverend Jesse Jackson about his claims and asked him if there is any evidence that Duncan died from neglect.
There's substantial evidence in the neglect of Eric Thomas. That is Thomas Eric Duncan. There are three protocols the CDC set out. One was identification. If you're from West Africa, Guinea, or Liberia, or Sierra Leone, that should be a signal. That's the epicenter of the Ebola crisis. Second one was diagnosis, to do thorough blood tests and test. He was out of there in 4 hours. That did not happen. The third was safe, secure, and quick treatment. That did not happen, beside the fact he did not have health insurance. And so all the protocols were missed. And so he, for about 8 days, he didn't get treatment, and he died unnecessarily.
Let me ask you about a couple of those particular issues. For instance, you say that Duncan was treated differently because he was sent home in that initial visit. According to the hospital, he didn't state that he was from Liberia. He specifically said no to questions about whether he had cared for a patient with the deadly virus, which he had, and whether or not he had touched the body of someone who had died in an area affected by the disease. So if Duncan didn't tell the truth out of fear, whatever reason he might have chosen, how do you blame the hospital for not treating him for Ebola specifically?
You must distinguish between the legality of his issue at the border. He went through 5 examinations. You are interviewed before you come into the airport, interviewed, tested once you come into the airport, and the 5th stage is you sign the papers. He said he didn't know he had any signs of Ebola. He got into the country, aside from the politics of it, and he walked in the hospital with Ebola. He left out with Ebola. So they dismissed him with the disease, which means he spread the disease even more. What happened at the hospital must be separate from what happened at the Visa and Passport Office.
Okay, let me ask you about this allegation over the ZMapp drug.
And I might add, the attempt to discredit him and make him a criminal is a way of justifying his not getting first-class treatment.
Well,
if he's a medical refugee, the fact of the matter is, we're paying a big price now for not having treated him when he first came into the hospital.
Right, and I don't think necessarily that he's treated as a criminal if he didn't disclose all this information, so much as whether or not he was treated correctly. But I want to ask you about the allegation over the ZMapp drug. It was given to 2 American missionaries who contracted the virus and recovered. Duncan was not given ZMapp, and in your blog you state this. You say, quote, "The use of ZMapp raises the question of privilege. Is it only those with better connections to positions of power who will get a fighting chance to receive this experimental drug?" End quote. But in that blog you didn't mention that the missionary couple who was given ZMapp, they were given it around July 22nd. According to the hospital, ZMapp was not given to Thomas Duncan because it was not available since August 12th, and he first showed up at the hospital in Dallas on September 20th. Instead, he was given an experimental treatment of some other antiviral drug. The question is ZMapp being withheld from patients because of their skin color or because of availability?
I'm not sure. There are those who argue that there were no ZMapp available. We tend not to believe that. But ZMapp is not the only remedy. There is the recovery in Nebraska, the NBC Newsman. There are those recovering in Nigeria and recovering even some within Liberia and even Guinea who don't have ZMapp. So ZMapp is a preferred medicine because it works so well in the case of Emory University. But he went for several days. When he was turned away from the hospital, he got no treatment. He came back, he got no treatment for about 2 days. He was in isolation and on a water drip. And until we took the protest public, he began to get some treatment that was working. As a matter of fact, when we talked with the doctors last Tuesday, his temperature had come down, his blood count had leveled off. He was, in fact, improving, but that was extreme trauma to the kidney and to the lungs infection. and that could not be overcome. So by Wednesday morning, he died. But clearly, his getting late treatment and little treatment was a big factor in his death.
At some point, was he given antibiotics by the hospital in his first or even second visit to the hospital? My understanding is that in his first visit, he was given some antibiotics and then sent home. Is that not correct?
That's our understanding, but antibiotics is not the answer to the issue. First issue is hydration. He came in, he left after 4 hours on a gurney. He was very sick. He came in with 103-degree temperature and had all the signs of Ebola having come from West Africa. Did not get a thorough diagnosis. The result is that those who treated him as having flu symptoms, they contracted the disease. Even if this were a misdiagnosis, then they put themselves in jeopardy by not having the proper protocol of precautions. And therefore, a nurse is seriously ill today because of the treatment when he came in and was turned away.
And to that point, because it does appear to be a misdiagnosis, because these staff members in the hospital put themselves in harm's way by treating him without taking the precautions. Finally, I'd ask you this. Do you believe that if Thomas Eric Duncan had insurance, there's a comment about insurance here, that if he had had insurance, he would have been treated differently than he was treated? And again, if this goes back to an issue of just a misdiagnosis, isn't that the real culprit here, not racism?
Well, those who have first-class medical insurance have better treatment than those who have Medicaid or who have no insurance. And that's black, white, or brown. There's no doubt about that. That's why the state of Texas, for example, has access to $100 billion from the federal government, from President Obama, in Medicaid. They reject the entire Medicaid package, which would in fact help people who may have Ebola, who may have flu, pneumonia, may need mammograms, a whole range of sicknesses not being dealt with because that state rejects out of hand $100 billion in Medicaid money from the federal government.
Appreciate
now, the extent to which race was, there's several things. There's race, there is timely treatment, there is adequate medical treatment, there's turning a man away with 103-degree temperature on a gurney. All of the signs that should not have been missed.
Absolutely. The signs should not have been missed. Certainly they were, and the end result of that was tragic. Reverend Jackson, thank you for your time. That is civil rights activist Reverend Jesse Jackson. Thank you.